My name is Chris Becks. I'm president of the Remnant Trust here at Texas Tech. We appreciate you coming out to hear what we expect to be a very interesting talk this evening. I'd like to acknowledge a few people and thank a few people that have been influential and allowed us to be here. Of course, first and foremost, Texas Tech University for the relationship they have with us, with the Remnant Trust, making this possible. We also would like to thank our faculty advisory committee. At least one of them is here tonight who helped set us up and help us identify the speakers that we can bring in at times and also help guide us into our involvement on the Tech campus and on campuses around the country as well. We appreciate them. We also acknowledge the Helen Jones and CH Foundation for their support of the Remnant Trust's efforts here on campus and elsewhere. We always appreciate that very much. And I'd also point out two other people that you've seen milling about here quite a bit that I need to thank personally. And they're the two people in the back working the cameras and the equipment. Mallory Craigbaum and Alex Root make it possible for the Remnant Trust to do the things that we like to do here on campus and elsewhere. They make my life incredibly more efficient and often easier in ways that I couldn't even begin to enumerate. So I appreciate everything that they do. I think it's always interesting to get to introduce someone, especially when somebody I kind of know, I have some sort of relationship with on the outside of my professional job. And it reminds me of giving someone a resume and then asking for a copy of it back when you go in for the job interview so that you can remember all the really cool and amazing things you've done in your life. And I thought about making up a variety of those things for Bruce tonight, but I didn't know how that would go over. But Bruce Brasington is a professor of history at West Texas A&M University, where he has been for several decades, if I'm not mistaken there. He got his BA from Oklahoma State University in history, as a master's from Southern Methodist, and then I believe a second master's and eventually his PhD from UCLA. He's a Regents Professor for the Texas A&M University system. He's also a Piper Foundation professor and has an interest in medieval English history, which we'll be hearing about some tonight. But it's often the things that he does beyond his professional life that I think make things a bit more interesting. Of course, if you spend any time with Bruce, you'll understand that he has a deep affection for his wife Darlene and spending time with her. And I know that they are both very good cooks and hosts. They like to entertain, and I've been privileged to that hospitality on more than one occasion. And the one thing I'll leave you with is that Bruce has also been known to co-host classic rock shows on campus radio station. I don't know exactly how much that'll influence his talk tonight on the Magna Carta, but I'm looking forward to finding out a bit about that. And the last thing I would point out is that Bruce is going to talk about not just the Magna Carta, but the influential documents that surround it and influence the Magna Carta's development and its impact further. And I find this particularly appropriate to the work of the Remnant Trust, because in our collection, we tried to focus on, point out that it's a timeline of the development of these ideas of liberty and dignity, that none of them existed in a vacuum or exists in a vacuum currently, and it's about their interactions. So without any more, Dr. Bruce Brasington.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be here down at Texas Tech. My very good friend and colleague, John Howe. It's always good to see you. And thank you so much for inviting me. Dr. Balch, the Institute for Western Civilization, the Remnant Trust, thank you all for inviting me. And thank you so much for coming. I know it's a busy time. Apparently there are other lectures going on this evening, and I trust that, and I hope that what I have to say here will be meaningful and interesting, and whichever classic rock group, I'm sort of kind of feeling Led Zeppelin for some reason at the moment, so we'll see. But I will be talking a little bit about Magna Carta, but quite frankly, I'm going to be talking about a whole lot of other people, perhaps, a whole lot of other texts that you've not heard of. But let's get started. You have a handout. I also have this PowerPoint, so let's begin. Now to my talk. Given that the Trust holds a manuscript of Magna Carta, which is right over there, which we have also been privileged to use in our classes at West Texas A&M, it indeed at first seems sensible to go to the Great Charter and reflect on how it shaped our history. And I certainly will mention it in passing. But I have to admit that I grew uneasy over time. I realized that Magna Carta has received quite a bit of attention in recent years. After all, the 800th anniversary was just 3 years ago. I will also confess that I'm not a specialist in medieval English law. I work on the Roman law in the Middle Ages and the canon law, the ecclesiastical law. So I started thinking in that direction. I settled on the story of a maxim, a phrase that was born in the Roman law and then developed in the Middle Ages. A maxim, a phrase that became an argument for government constrained by our consent. Quod omnes tangit, omnibus approbetur. That which touches all or concerns all must be approved by all. The journey of these few words, from Rome to London to Boston to Philadelphia, demonstrates the rich, vital heritage preserved and advanced by the Trust. These words also speak to our own day. For governments still need to be reminded that they are our servants, not our masters. And equally, we as citizens must be mindful that with our consent comes responsibility to one another. Now, such focus on the Middle Ages in Rome would not have pleased all the authors preserved by the Trust. Consider our second president, John Adams. In his dissertation on the canon and feudal law, written while still a loyal subject of the crown, Adams declares, quote, "Since the promulgation of Christianity, the two greatest systems of tyranny that have sprung from this original are the canon and the feudal law." While confident that feudal tyranny had been in retreat ever since Magna Carta, Adams reminds his readers that Rome, the lair of popes and their evil canon law, still remained to threaten loyal Englishmen, loyal Protestants on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet his contemporary, David Delaney, at the same time did not hesitate to recall those Middle Ages when thundering against the Stamp Act. Looking back some 500 years, he notes, quote, that the great King Edward I inserted in his writ of summons as a first principle of law that quod omnes tangit, his spelling, omnibus approbetur, which by no torture could be made to signify that their approbation or consent only is to be required in the imposition of a tax, who are to play no part in it. Now, as Delaney saw it, Parliament's imposing of the Stamp Act without the Americans' representation in Parliament and permission violated English law. Thus, it was self-evident that consent required representation, which of course the Americans didn't have. This is a story that's familiar to you, I know. Little did Delaney know, writing in 1765, that his useful Latin phrase had already had a long history behind it when Edward I had cited it. He would have likely been even more startled to discover it had come neither from a medieval king nor from England. Rather, it had appeared 1,000 years earlier in the practical affairs of Roman law. Quod omnes tangit came from the Roman law concerning guardianship. That is the legal authority over someone, for example, a minor, who could not administer his own affairs. If there were multiple guardians, tutores in the Latin, none could act on the ward's behalf without the other's consent. That this pragmatic rule about guardianship and contracts would become in the Middle Ages an argument for the people limiting their government, and sometimes the opposite, government's control over the people. Really, it demonstrates how our Western tradition is like mustard seeds, sown through the volumes of the Trust. Some, like quod omnes tangit, grow great and bear much fruit. So let's move forward to the Middle Ages, more specifically to the late 11th century, where it was then that the Digest, the great encyclopedia of the Roman law, compiled by the Emperor Justinian some 6 centuries earlier, was rediscovered in Italy. Soon thereafter, law schools sprang up to teach that Roman law, and soon the Church's canon law as well. From the pens of jurists, lawyers, and theologians, quod omnes tangit, this Roman law concerning contracts, took flight in new directions. For example, There's quod omnes tangit from the Codex. New questions arose. For example, could the Pope be removed from office if later judged a heretic? After being elected, like today, by the College of Cardinals, was the Pope now above the law, answerable to no one? Now, while many thought so, some took the opposite view. And this text we have here is an example of that position. An excerpt from an anonymous commentary on the canon law from the late 12th century. To this author and others, even the Pope, even after his election, was bound to a contract because he had been elected. Thus, quod omnes tangit applied to him. After all, should not the electors have some say as to whether he remained fit for office? Did not an elected leader, even the Pope, remain in a contract with them, and by extension the entire church? Moreover, what the leader did naturally touched all. So what happened if the Pope became a heretic? Since heresy was not a private matter, for like a disease, it affected the entire body of Christ, ought not all, or at the very least his electors, judge him if he deviated from the faith? By 1200, barely a century into this new study of law, we are already a long way indeed from guardianship of a minor. Across the channel, English jurisprudents were also becoming interested in this Roman phrase. However, rather than quod omnes tangit constraining a ruler within a contract, the 13th century English jurisprudent Brasington, so fundamental for the foundation of our legal system. Magna Carta is so incredibly important. But Brasington, who lived at the same time, he is the foundation of English jurisprudence. Brasington read this phrase differently. To Brasington, even the Pope, okay, excuse me, drop down the bottom of the page, I got excited. Okay, quod omnes tangit, he saw this as a limitation on the people, not on the king. Focusing on the tangit, the concern, or touching all, Brasington stressed that no one could shirk his obedience to the law. To Brasington, and some later commentators, as we shall see, our responsibility as citizens to that law, and by definitions its source, the king, our responsibility precedes our consent. Things are getting complicated. Now we come to Edward's writ, which Delaney cited. This expresses Brasington's view. Summoning Parliament in 1295, this writ, this decree, is one of the most important documents in English legal and political history, and frankly for our own Constitution as well. For it called the Model Parliament, the first one really deserving the name. To Westminster came the highest ranks of the clergy, including the Archbishops of York and Canterbury, no less than 7 earls, knights from every shire in the kingdom, and from every city and borough, 2 representatives. Here was Brasington's all, his omnes, community of the realm, and the king's writ expected their consent, for Edward needed money. Like George III centuries later, Edward, fighting both Scotland and France, expected consent to new taxes. After various deals, he got his money, and in doing so set the precedent that Parliament had to be called and asked to consent to taxes. To Edward and his successors, that asking was, of course, just a formality. They expected the people to pay. What touched all, the king's defense of the realm, that naturally required and demanded the people's approval. But others would see it the other way around, that regardless of how vital defense might be, consent came before taxation. Ideas are like Velcro. All sorts of things stick to them. Over the next 3 centuries, centuries marked by world historical events like the European encounter with the New World, the Renaissance, the Reformation, quod omnes tangit attracted all sorts of commentators. We have Marsilius of Padua's defensor pacem, the defender of the peace, in one of these cases. To my mind, of course I'm prejudiced, an extraordinarily precious work. Marsilius, writing in the 13th centuries, 1300s, brought the maxim back to the people and declared that their consent bound rulers, from popes to emperors. He then grounded that consent in words that echo Aristotle, that the people make the law. Quote, the authority to make the law belongs only to those men whose making of it will cause the law to be better observed by all. Only the whole body of citizens are such men. To them, therefore, belongs the authority to make the law. For men came together in civil community in order to attain what was beneficial for the sufficiency of life and to avoid the opposite. Those matters, therefore, which can affect the benefit and harm of all ought to be known and heard by all, in order that they may be able to attain the beneficial and to avoid the opposite. Ought to be known and heard by all. Quod omnes tangit lies behind these words, and indeed throughout Marsilius' defender of the peace. Let's reflect on a moment, for just a moment. Centuries before John Locke, Delaney, Madison, Jefferson, Marsilius, an Italian critic of the papacy, boldly declared that the citizens are not passive subjects whose consent to governments is taken for granted. No, the citizens make the law. Their civil community, a voluntary union touching all, was all the authority they needed. Authority lay not in divine right, not in class, not in wealth, not in blood. No, it was their right. No wonder the Pope anathematized the book in 1326. And later during the Reformation, it was put on the index of forbidden books. It's a dangerous book back there. That's why I like it. It was also during the Reformation, when quod omnes tangit crossed the ocean, Bartholomew de las Casas used it to defend the rights of indigenous people in the New World. To Las Casas, it mattered not whether you were in Europe or Peru. The people had the right to consent, not only to a bishop, but to a ruler. Quote, how much less should an earthly ruler or king be given to a foreign, free people, Gentile and infidel, who having their own natural kings do not recognize a superior. It matters not whether you're a Catholic or an indigenous person of Peru. You should have the right to approve or consent your ruler. One would, I think, be hard-pressed to find a better statement of the reason why we gather here this evening, to recognize and proclaim liberty and human dignity. For freedom's country has no border. Thus far, I hope that this overview has given you some sense of the depth and range of influence exerted by quod omnes tangit from the Middle Ages on. Now it is time to move towards Delaney and the founding. And our first stop, not surprisingly, is England. Drawing on Marsilius of Padua, the great Elizabethan scholar Richard Hooker connected quod omnes tangit with due process, which of course is something that's also such a fundamentally important chapter 29 in Magna Carta. To Hooker, quod omnes tangit, this phrase that came from Roman contract law, has to do with the due process that we all must have as citizens. To Hooker, the law binds all, including the king. It would be utterly wrong, in Hooker's splendid language, against all equity, for someone, anyone, to be at another's legal mercy. The law touched all lay under its obligation, thus all must be granted the same protection and procedure. The next time you hear the phrase equal protection under law, the next time somebody invokes due process, remember, alongside Magna Carta, the Italian, the Englishman, and quod omnes tangit. Now, undoubtedly, the most decisive moment of the long journey of quod omnes tangit was the English Civil War of the 1600s. A conflict in whose mirror Americans would later see their own grievances. And we have documents concerning John Hampden here also in the case. Consider the story of the parliamentarian John Hampden. In the 1630s, he refused to pay ship money to Charles I. Charles was struggling, like Edward I centuries earlier, to find ways to finance his government. Unlike the medieval king, however, he did not call a parliament, and with good reason. The last one he had dismissed in 1628, after its petition of right had challenged royal power and authority. If you've never looked at the Petition of Rights, do so at some point. Thomas Jefferson certainly did when he penned the Declaration of Independence. It's an astonishing document. So he could not call a new parliament, so he was trying to govern England without calling a parliament. Now, without a new parliament, the king needed to collect customary taxes that were already on the books. Ship money seemed to be above dispute. The Navy, after all, defended the nation. The crown had thus collected this tax for centuries. Why call a new parliament to approve something so beneficial to all and something so customary? However, when Charles began to demand it in the 1630s, opposition grew. Men like John Hampden did not see things the king's way. Not having met, Parliament had not approved this particular tax. Ship money was also being collected from places hitherto free from paying. I'm sure the taxpayers of Portsmouth and Dover had long complained, but at least it made sense there to give money in taxes to build ships. What did that have to do with deepest Buckinghamshire? Thus, John Hampden saw the ship money as doubly unprecedented and illegal. He refused, and he went to trial. At the trial, both Crown prosecution and Hampden's defense employed our maxim. The Crown's position restated what Edward I had declared centuries earlier, but with language also changed. Instead of approved, now whatever the king required had to be supported. Somehow the phrase, make you an offer you can't refuse, comes to mind. It's not classic rock, it's The Godfather, but I think it'll do, right? Whatever the king requires has to be supported. In his able, if unsuccessful defense, St. John, Hampden's attorney, curtly replied that consent came before support. In that exchange, in that conflict, in that war of words over quod omnes tangit, we find not only the conflict between king and commons that would eventually lead to civil war, but also in anticipation of our own revolution a century later. No less an important precedent came from the 1650s, when under Cromwell's son, Parliament debated the relationship of Scotland to England. Though the kingdoms had been united since 1607, all sorts of constitutional and legal problems remained. After all, England was a commonwealth. The future Charles II still in exile across the Channel. That didn't matter. The government needed money. And that meant money from Scotland as well. Sir Charles Vane, taking the government's position, argued that Scotland was alien. I think I could say this since much of my blood is Scottish. I agree, Scotland is quite alien, actually. To Vane, Scotland had to do what England said, for she had neither shires nor boroughs. Thus, the Scots had no right to representation in Parliament, and no reason to protest. To Vane, the Scots had to pay their taxes. Taking the opposite view was the Solicitor General Ellis, who replied, quote, "Advice knows not how it can be a Parliament of England, Scotland, and Ireland if you have no Scotch or Irish there. If you turn them out, you can make no law to sit them there. Sit them here, excuse me. You break the union, and then must come to a new union, end quote. As we all know, that break did come a little more than a century later, and an ocean away. And there again, quod omnes tangit would strike one of the blows. Occasionally one hears how the founders were guided by the lamp of experience. Their conviction that history's light illumined past, present, and future. Well, by the 1770s, that lamp had become a torch. With Boston Harbor closed under the intolerable acts, John Quincy caught up history's sparks, among them quod omnes tangit. It's a lengthy quote, but I think it's well worth reading. Englishmen in the reign of Henry IV had the virtue and courage to declare it in Parliament as the undoubted right of the kingdom, not to be charged with aught for the defense of the realm or safeguard of the seas, but by their own will and consent in Parliament. Had Britons in the age of George III had been as considerate of the spirit of their laws and constitution, or attended to that old rule, to do as you would be done by, they would not have charged America with a large revenue for, quote, the subsistence of troops and military expenses, end quote, without consulting its local parliaments and against the will of its commons, more especially since it was the position of the able, though most arbitrary prince, Edward I of England, touching martial affairs, quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbetur. We've gone from Roman guardianship law and contracts to the eve of the American Revolution. If that doesn't illustrate the power and vitality of force of ideas and ideas have consequences, I don't know what does. It's extraordinary. No doubt there are many ways to read Quincy's words, but we shall always debate the causes of the revolution. For many today, Quincy's language was all about class interest, defense of property and rights. For others today, the words merely masked racism and sexism. Now, I am not an American historian, and thus tread lightly here, but I'm going to tread nonetheless. I believe we should not ignore the older traditional view that the force of ideas, not just self-interest, prejudice, misogyny, that the force of ideas also compelled men and women to take their stand against Parliament and Crown. Such was the case, I believe, with these angry Americans, like Hampton and St. John a century earlier. To them, quod omnes tangit stated a fundamental human right, liberty. That government is our servant, not our master. And that government exists and acts by our consent alone. Liberty. Now, what does this brief survey of Western legal and political history mean for the American experiment today? You may be thinking the quod omnes tangit is mighty fine in theory, but 2018 is a long way from Delaney and Quincy, let alone Hooker, Bracton, and Marsilius of Padua. Moreover, these old Latin words are ambiguous, even threatening. Who are the all? What is concern? What is approval? Does the maxim in fact demand, as did the English kings, that we support an oppressive government? One today infinitely more powerful than in the days of Edward I and George III. Should we just automatically consent to anything and everything that government provides and demands, whether we like it or not? However, if we take the opposite view, as I do, and stand with St. John Delaney and others that quod omnes tangit binds government to our consent, what does that mean today? However stirring that sounds, is such agreement not just a fantasy? For we Americans seemingly cannot agree on anything, and every day we seem more fractured, as epitomized by another maxim. A remarkable translation made by Al Gore some years ago. E pluribus unum, out of one, many. Can that which concerns all must be approved by all speak to such a divided, distracted America? To look for an answer, let us turn to our tradition, to John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. His Fabius letters offer us an understanding of quod omnes tangit, that neither privileges government, nor allows our consent to become mere opinion and license. He expresses a vision of what Russell Kirk would later call ordered liberty. Dickinson wrote these letters in the spring of 1788 to explain and defend the Constitution. Accordingly, they take their place alongside the far more famous Federalist Papers. While Delaney nowhere expresses, literally cites our Latin phrase, its traces are certainly scattered all about. Consider this quote. The Constitution provided by the Federal Convention now engages the fixed attention of America. What concerns all should be considered by all. And individuals may injure a whole society by not declaring their sentiments. It is therefore not only their right, but their duty to declare them. What concerns all should be considered by all. Concern and consideration. To Dickinson, these are not just a right or a choice, they are obligation. Dickinson also declares that concern, that consideration, that approval must be guided by sober reflection and public spirit. For, quote, by the superior will of the people is meant a reasonable, not a distracted will. When frenzy seizes the mass, they will infallibly have a Philip or a Caesar to bleed them into softness of mind. Only ordered, reasonable consent deserves a name. Anything else is the scream of the mob, and tyrants answer those calls. Turning to government, Dickinson says that we are not consenting up to it, whatever it may demand or provide. No, we must see our consent as extended one to another, to community. We are not isolated, grasping, frenzied individuals. We are citizens. Each individual then must contribute such a share of his rights as is necessary for attaining that security that is essential to freedom. And he is bound to make this contribution by the law of his nature, which prompts him to a participated happiness, that is, by the command of his Creator. Therefore, he must submit his will in what concerns all to the will of all, that is, of the whole society. What a striking phrase, participated happiness, which has its origins in Aristotle. There is no higher end to human order in this world. If I understand correctly, Dickinson would thus define quod omnes tangit, omnibus approbetur, this way. We gather as a community and create government to ensure happiness, a happiness that is shared. Our individual consent cannot be delegated to a far-off government, nor left to factions, nor sold to powerful individuals. What touches all, what concerns all, is both obligation and birthright as free men and women. For we are all ultimately bound by a contract far greater than the affairs of commerce and law. We must all strive to work together to benefit one another, to consent and approve what is best, not just what is convenient or expedient. Our mutual happiness rests not on a mere earthly contract, but on the very nature of being men and women under a Creator. And only the lamp of experience can cast away the dark, frenzied shadows that cloud our vision. A final point, very personal, connecting quod omnes tangit to our very unhappy world, the world of 2018. I believe these Latin words do not just treat politics and law. They confront the greatest crisis of our day, the root of many of our political and social ills, a crisis of meaning. This came to mind while I was reading a recent edition of National Review. There I came across an article by Michael Hendricks entitled Lonely America. Hendricks eloquently describes how we sit alone, transfixed by glowing screens. Community, from conversation to clubs to churches, is increasingly rare. To Hendricks, we have gained a new freedom, a freedom to live the commodified Spotify life, where nothing touches us unless we approve, and our approval is sovereign. Like Edward I and George III, we are kings, but sad rulers of a solitary realm. Our contract is to ourselves alone. Towards the end of this provocative essay, Hendricks notes that, quote, there is no bill in Congress that can ever satisfy the longings of the human heart for fellowship. Government cannot bind us together. No, but we can. We can come together as a community gathered around these books. Our community must not be just of the living, but I believe also of the dead. They too are the omnes. To that end, a final quote. This time from someone who undoubtedly knew quod omnes tangit, but as far as I know, never cited it directly. His name is Machiavelli, from one of his letters written in exile. When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my workaday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and I put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine, and for which I was born, where I am unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time, I feel no boredom. I forget all my troubles. I do not dread poverty. I am not terrified by death. I absorb myself into them completely. Let us join Machiavelli. Let us put on history's royal robes. For we are under contract not only with one another, but also with the dead, with those who've gone before. And the future depends on us to keep faith. We, omnes, gather as a community here. Around us stand as well the men and women who read these books before us and were the authors themselves. At our center, the ideas. They concern us all. They challenge us to extend our fellowship to a fragmented, narcissistic age. Only our great tradition, even the obscure maxims of Roman contract law, can guide us. No government, no program, no amount of money can replace that. If the American experiment is to succeed, it must forever be lit by that lamp of experience. From Rome, Athens, and Jerusalem, to London, Philadelphia, and Lubbock. And let its light touch us all. Thank you very much. I'll open it, please. I'll blame it on the water. Sure, if anybody has any
We
questions.
can open it up and invite you guys to ask a couple questions of Bruce.
And again, I apologize for the lack of Magna Carta. Sir, please.
Yeah, where were you last week when we had to put up with Madison's opulent minority? And how did they gain that change from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution we suffer?
I can't answer that.
I know, but could you try?
At heart, I'm an anti-federalist.
Well, I mean, there has to be a historical perspective that allowed that opulent minority to take control over the Aristotelian flaw of democracy.
We cannot separate, however passionate a Whig I am about the ideas, the power of ideas, we can't separate them from individuals' interests.
I understand.
Right? Now, that's just my view, right?
Well,
But you know something? I always tell my students, because whatever stands behind those words, they're still ideals. And the Declaration of Independence, for example, the Bill of Rights, is like a mirror. It's not the mirror's fault that I look the way I do. The ideals are still there and they still reflect. I agree. And of course, I have a colleague, Matt Reardon, who's a specialist in colonial American history. And I told him, I confessed to him that I was going to be kind of like a Whig tonight. because he's somebody who believes very much in the idea of class interest and gender and those with the power in the country, that the Constitution was one of the worst things that could have happened to the United States. That the ideals were betrayed and went into the hands of those people with the power and the interest. Yeah, but you know, that may be true to some extent. I don't know, because I'm not an American historian. I try my best to be a medieval historian. But the ideas still can be read in many different ways. And even if liberty is penned by somebody who believes that liberty only belongs to certain people, a certain color of skin, a certain religious view, how much money you have, what's your blood, it's still freedom. And that idea is there to be taken by somebody else and moved forward. But I don't know, I'm getting kind of preachy. Sir.
So when you have that John Dickinson statement up there, I don't know if you could go back.
Sure, I'll go back. Sure. I think so. You can tell that
There we go.
I'm not the
Right.
most sophisticated person.
He must submit his will in what concerns all to the will of all, that is, of the whole society. That's striking like Rousseau. I wonder now, Dickinson's what, he's writing at the time of the ratification?
Absolutely.
So he easily could have known Rousseau.
Sure.
So in that notion of what concerns all, requires the approval of all, there's a kind of backflow in which all then can concern themselves with the individual. And there's a tale to be told there as well. So what would you say?
No, I agree with you, and I will be honest with you, and I actually defer to my colleague, Dr. Schaefer, who knows a lot more about American history than I do, and Dr. Pearson. But yeah, I think there's obviously a connection there as well. The great tension, isn't it, is that we want everyone's consent. On the other hand, there's the great fear of factions, there's the great fear of the mob. But I would be perfectly willing to believe that I've not done a formal study of Dickinson, so he might have been influenced by Rousseau. But I don't know if I'm addressing your question.
Well, no, that's part of the question. Might Rousseau be in there?
Sure. Sir, please.
Do you not also see this in Blackstone's Laws of England, where man is dependent and must submit his will to the Almighty, and that no laws are valid unless they agree?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at I added kind of a brief bibliography to the handout, and it is brief. Because if I claim that I'm the first person to study this, lightning would strike me dead right here. Because it is something that really since appeared right after World War II, when we have a real renaissance of the study of medieval law and going to manuscripts. But all sorts of people, like Brian Tierney, for example, Gaines Post, who have written eloquently on this. And you're right, Blackstone does it. What's interesting, of course, is that Bracton, who is so incredibly important for the history of English law, comes out with the idea that it is limiting the people rather than limiting the ruler. But other people take it in different directions, don't they? The article that's my one contribution to the bibliography, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because after all, maxims are wonderful things. They can be used in all sorts of different ways, but you bet Blackstone knew it inside and out. And if Blackstone used it, then that, by definition, meant that the founders knew it inside and out as well. Was there any book, and we talk about Locke, the importance of Magna Carta, all these things, and I grant that, but is there anybody more important in the 18th century than Blackstone? I mean, he's right next to your bed.
Blackstone and the Bible were the two most important references for the Constitution.
Sir, please.
If you know, what would Thomas More have said about this?
I don't know. Because utopia carries with the idea of hierarchy. Of course, hierarchy would be present here. I don't know. I don't think that More ever used it. I don't know. I'm certainly familiar. I mean, I am familiar with utopia, but I have to admit that's the what is familiar. I know utopia. That is, but the idea that other things you could. I don't know. What do you think? Why did More come to mind when you brought that up?
Well, it's talking about the idea of whether it is the people that are limited or the reigning king.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, More gave his life because he said the king should be limited and should have to follow the law.
Because his allegiance was ultimately to Rome. Right? And this, the tension, if we were just going to be doing canon law, if we were just going to be doing the medieval period, then you have people lining up on both sides. There's the maxim papa anemone judicator. The Pope may be judged by no one, right? Well, that would seem pretty clear that quod omnes tangit doesn't apply to the Pope. Except other people will say, no, the Pope is limited, for example, by natural law. By the time you get the conciliar movement in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, when you have the Great Schism, critics of the papacy will begin to use quod omnes tangit even more. Okay, because it's obviously, wait a minute, if the Pope is under contract, and we have 2 people or 3 people claiming to be Pope, well then why shouldn't we, the electors, come together and elect a new Pope? The Pope is not above the law. But as for more, I just don't know. And then in context of the Reformation, to my knowledge, Luther doesn't use it. I don't know whether Calvin does, so believe me, there's plenty more to look at. And I'm not going to claim that I know all this, all of it. I know a little shit. Other questions or comments about this?
Why don't we thank Dr.
Well, thank you so much.